Welcome to the Fair Districts Fair Democracy Huddle. We have been having Fair Districts huddles for 5 years, and of course, other meetings long before that, but pretty much monthly meetings for many years. And thank you so much to everyone who has been participating. And you know, redistricting is such a foundational, important thing for democracy, but there are other things that are also incredibly important and foundational for strengthening and rescuing our democracy. And so we wanted to kind of branch out a little bit, and that's what we'll be doing this year. And it just happened that Sunshine Week is, I think it's actually next week. So this is a perfect time to talk about Sunshine Week, open government. Kathiann is an expert, and she's brought these other experts with her as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Kathiann, and we're all going to learn about shining a light on government.
Well, once again, welcome. Please, throw your name and where you're from into the chat. And there's a Q&A area, so put your questions and answers there. One of the things that Kelly will share is a resource doc. You'll notice that's in the chat right now. We'll also be sending you a follow-up, which will include the slides. It will include a recording, and then it'll also include all of these different resources. So don't worry if you see something, and you can check into that Google Doc, but do not worry, we'll be sending this to you tomorrow. And I just wanted to say, I was looking at the chat. They're just people from all over Ohio. And so if you haven't yet, please throw your name in and where you're from, and welcome. And with that, we are here celebrating Sunshine Week, and I firmly believe that sunshine is the best disinfectant. I became interested in open records and open government because I was worried about corruption. But of course, if we don't have open records, if we don't have open meetings, it is incredibly challenging to figure out what's happening in government and for us to participate, not just on election day, but throughout the whole year. And so Mia, if you'll go to the next slide. So we have a pretty packed agenda. Gary Daniels from ACLU Ohio is going to walk us through Ohio Sunshine Law, some of the challenges, and there is some legislation at the Statehouse that could make things really complicated for public records. Many of you will remember that there was, a change in open records in the budget, and so we will talk about that as well. So Randy Ludlow. So whenever I go and I try to get ready, I check out, the bios. And his bio from the Dispatch described him as an old school muckraker. And so he's going to provide some tips on public records requests. And then we are going to hear from Kathiann Kowalski. She's going to talk about how reporters use public records and how we can do so as well. So once again, we're going to do some Q&A, because one of the things that'll happen as you're hearing all this is you'll have a bunch of questions. So please put that in the Q&A box, and I'll make sure to ask. We'll talk about resources, ways to take action, and then finally we'll wrap up. And with that, I one of the things I love are all of the political cartoons, and I just thought this was one that was really special. Just the whole notion of let's shine some light on Congress, let's shine some light on the Statehouse. And with that, I'm going to introduce Gary Daniels. So Gary is the legislative director for ACLU Ohio. He actually began working for ACLU Ohio in the 1990s. And one of the things that I've always loved about when Gary goes to testify, he will describe himself as the chief lobbyist for ACLU Ohio. And the thing that's interesting is folks will go to many lengths to never actually describe themselves as a lobbyist. But Gary is somebody who knows the Statehouse inside out and is very conversant in Ohio public records law. And with that, Gary, I'm going to hand it right over to you.
Well, you're too kind, Kathiann and Mia, describing myself among the experts here on tonight's presentation. There are experts here, and then there's me. But I will try my best here to walk you through a little bit of Ohio's public records laws. Keep in mind, one thing that hasn't been said is when we talk about Ohio's sunshine laws, we're talking about not only Ohio's public records laws, but also open meetings laws. To the extent that sunshine laws can be described as sexy whatsoever, public records are the sexier of the two there. And open meetings is pretty easy. We can take that during Q&A if anybody has any questions. But I think, Kathiann and those of us who have done these presentations together before know that when we do them, the overwhelming bulk of the interest in this is on public records, not open meetings, which is why we concentrate on the public records part of it. And a quick disclaimer, I'm getting over, I don't know what it is, cold, flu, whatever's going around, so my voice is hoarse, and hoping that it holds out for the remainder of the webinar here, and I am confident that it will be. But if you hear me or see me go mute myself and cough or drink from something, you'll know what exactly is going on. One final thing, this is not to give you all encyclopedic knowledge of Ohio's public records laws. This is to give you a quick overview. But I think essentially, unless you want to do some really, really deep digging, getting the basics of what's going on is exactly what you will need here. And there will be resources provided to do that deeper dive should you wish. So in Ohio, when you're talking about what exactly is a public record, it's not that complicated. We're talking about government records, but more specifically, we're talking about, and quite obviously, records that are stored on a fixed medium. What's that mean? Well, is it captured somewhere on paper? Or on a video, or on computer, digitally, those sorts of things. Is it created, received, or sent under the jurisdiction of that public office? That is, does it belong to that office, or did it first emanate from that office? And importantly here, number three, and you have to meet all three of these criteria, does it document the functions, the procedures, the policies, etc. of that public office? Does it shine light on what exactly that public office, that entity, that body is up to? And here in Ohio, thankfully, under Ohio law, government records are presumed to be open, that is, publicly available. However, there are numerous exceptions, and those have grown over the years and continue to grow. Not always a negative thing, actually. We'll get into that here in a little bit, but it does continue to grow because I think of what can be considered a certain amount of hostility from the General Assembly, that is, legislators in the Ohio Statehouse, with regard to this topic and your right to know about these issues. So among some of those exemptions, some of them are very common sense. Medical records, should it reveal people's, personal health situations, intellectual property records and trade secrets, attorney work product. So you couldn't, for instance, do a public records request of the Attorney General's office and see exactly how they're preparing for a trial or a criminal case or something like that. And one that's abused an awful lot, at least in my opinion, and I have a feeling my fellow co-panelists would agree, something called the CLEAR exemption, confidential law enforcement investigatory records. Again, there's some common sense reasons to have that in place. You don't want somebody who, let's say, is part of a criminal gang doing a public records request to their local police department to find out who the confidential informants are or who the undercover officers are that are investigating what it is that they're up to. But that is read very broadly under Ohio law, that clear exemption, and is something that those of us who do this stuff have to deal with an awful lot. But you can find, those of us who have to deal with this stuff, in our sleep, on our deathbed, what have you, we're going to be reciting Ohio Revised Code section 149.43, all of the time, continue to be doing that. But that's where you can find a full list of exemptions under Ohio law. And the trend tends to be these days towards, some of it at least, towards protecting personal privacy of like government employees and stuff, ensuring their home addresses are not like available via public record, things of that nature. I do want to bring you up to speed here on some developments over the past several years coming from the State House. Not all of them. Again, this isn't, to give you encyclopedic knowledge, but some things that we thought you might find helpful or interesting along these lines. Number one, back in 2018 and becoming law in 2019, was really what the ACLU of Ohio considers a model bill with regard to how to handle issues of police cameras and public records. Keeping in mind, when you're law enforcement, sometimes you come across situations that can be very traumatic, embarrassing, violent, a variety of things that impact actual individuals, actual people, people on their worst day by far. And what you get are people who exploit public records laws, make public records requests for certain videos, and then they blast them online via YouTube or their blog or whatever else. And so you've got people who, they might, have their arms chopped off, they're laying in their yard, and people are getting that, accessing it via public records laws and putting it online. From the ACLU of Ohio's perspective, we have always seen public records as the purpose of them is to keep an eye on the government and what the government is up to, not what your neighbors are up to or the things that they are facing. So we were big supporters and movers and shakers, I think, on this particular bill, which is a bipartisan bill, House Bill 425, again passed in December 28, became law in April 2019. It mentions on that slide there, I think it threads that needle of government transparency and personal privacy. So under the law, the bill now law, it says that, yeah, these videos, police body camera videos and dash cam videos, those are public records, presumed to be public records, just like we have under current Ohio law, except for those that reveal, quote, grievous bodily harm. That is, severe violence against a person's death, sexual assault, naked bodies, things of that nature that quite obviously we don't want for ourselves to be public and we don't want public for other people. I think reasonable people can agree. Except, and this is where the transparency comes in, those situations were caused by law enforcement or government. Then the switch flips back to it being public to provide transparency and hopefully accountability. And those videos can also be released and accessible with the consent of the person in the video. So I don't know if Ohio still remains the only state with a law of this type. I have done lobbying of my fellow ACLU staffers in other states to let them know about this law, and I know they have been interested in at least getting them introduced in some other states. I just don't know the progress of that in those other states. But to the credit, I will say, of current auditor Keith Faber, when he was in the legislature, this bill was his project. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's the Court of it's a different one that I'll get to here in a second. But this was a bipartisan bill right here, House Bill 425, that passed both chambers unanimously. So wide agreement that was needed. And it was one of those wonderful examples where you can have both parties get together, actually say this is a good idea and pass something. So while many of us are cognizant of the bad things that go on at the State House with regard to public records, there's an example of a good thing. House Bill 315, on the other hand, was passed late last legislative session in December 2025. It's a period called lame duck. After the election, at the end of the legislative session, they come back and they typically ram through a bunch of things that are controversial that they don't want people to know about. They did this during conference committee, that is, after hearings were already over, so that people didn't get a chance to come in and testify about it. You do this stuff deliberately. There's no, this is by design to do it that way so that the public doesn't have a chance to weigh in. But what it amounts to is that, if you can go back for a second there, Mia, thank you. It allows state and local law enforcement to charge records requesters the actual amount for preparation and production of requested public records that have that law enforcement variable, let's say, with it. Now, the amount is capped for now, because I always get worried about how they would make this worse. But for now, they can cap those costs at $75 an hour with a ceiling of 750 total per request. The problem here, of course, is this is public information. This is information you've already paid for as a taxpayer, and the state is saying, no, we can charge you up to $750 now for each record that you request. Next slide, Mia, please. This is part two of that thinking. We now have currently in the General Assembly the new legislative session, in which we're in year two of Ohio's two-year legislative session. We have House Bill 314. So I should say, yeah, that I made a mistake there. House Bill 315, that would have been back. Let's see, in 2024. Anyway, House Bill 314 is what we're dealing with now. It deals with quote unquote vexatious requesters. That is, people that the local government officials think request too many records and that they do it with the intention to disrupt or harass that local or state government office. And among the quote unquote evidence they can use for this is that you do have multiple requests to the same entity. They can take you to court then under this vexatious requester scheme, and the court can then place limits or totally deny your records request and or potentially future requests. And this bill also allows government entities to use and hire third parties to process what they think are voluminous requests and charge the full amount to the requester. So just like the bill we discussed, now law before that, at least there was a ceiling there with regard to how much they can charge. No ceiling here, at least yet, with regard to House Bill 314. And so it would be interesting to see how exactly this shakes out. But, the cake is not done here. This is a bill still in process. There's testimony going on. There's going to be a meeting with regard to this bill in a couple weeks. And so we hope to, if they're intent on passing this, improve the bill before it finally becomes law, if it goes that far. Now, journalists are exempt from the vexatious litigator provisions. I should say vexatious requester provisions. I said litigator there in the slide when I typed it up because it's modeled on Ohio's vexatious litigator law. So apologies for that. But journalists are exempt from the vexatious requester provisions, but not the third-party contractor ones and the costs that go into that. So again, they're trying to hide government information behind a paywall that's going to make it much, much more difficult for people to access this information to the extent I think it will cause an awful lot of people simply to never even try in the first place. So this idea that information you've already paid for is going to be behind paywalls is particularly offensive. I will say, though, there are some people out there that deliberately cause headaches for your local government offices requesting records, and they're not doing it in what I think is sort of a good way. They're doing it in ways to try to monetize stuff, making unnecessary requests, those sorts of things. I think we will eventually have to find some sort of compromise that not everybody is going to be happy with, but local governments have gotten in the ear of their local legislators and let them know what exactly the problems are they're facing in this regard. All right, Mia? Denied requests for public records here. You can go sort of what is the old-fashioned route. If you're denied, you can file a lawsuit, a mandamus action in your local court of common pleas, or go straight to the Ohio Supreme Court with your case to obtain the records or be denied. That can take a lot of time. ACLU of Ohio has done this. We have gone down this route. The Ohio Supreme Court does not like it. They don't like public records cases before them, mostly because it turns out that the people, the requesters, are fully entitled to the government records, and they just have been snowballed by the government entities throughout that process. So as a result, the legislature, this is where I was going to applaud current auditor Keith Faber for his work, created a related process, a mediation process where you can file with your local court of common pleas Go in, file online, pay 25 bucks, an attorney is not required, and you get kind of an abbreviated quasi court function that hopefully gets you records sooner rather than later. Again, I don't know that any other state does this. It's to Ohio's credit that we do it. And if you want to find out more about it, and I love telling people about this because I hope they will utilize it, including I've told plenty of reporters in Ohio about this process that did not know about it before then. But there's a link, and there will be a link at the end where you can go to the Ohio Court of Claims and you can find out more about this process. I think that does it for me right now. Okay.
So Gary, we did have a few questions for you. So one of the first has to do with like what is an actual, public record. So this is from Michael, and it'll take me just a second. So Michael is like, in Ohio, if a sitting council person has a discussion with another council person via text about a specific policy that they're considering, is this considered to be a public record?
Well, I will say, I will use that old joke that the answer to any legal question is it depends. And I don't mean to be a wise guy about that, but very recently the answer to that question has become more complicated potentially. So, otherwise, when we're talking about public records, we can be talking about any number of things, policies, budgets, other types of government documents, all those sorts of things, including in this case, emails and correspondence. The ACLU of Ohio and others have maintained over the years that when governments communicate, when legislators or government officials or anybody communicate with other people via text, via email, those sorts of things, those are, of course, public records, those are government documents. What has come into play, though, over the years is what if somebody's using their personal account, their personal phone number, their personal email to engage in some level of government business? Our take has always been, well, you don't get an out there saying, well, it wasn't officially, my email that ends in .gov kind of thing. It's just kind of a one-off thing that I texted somebody. For us, that's still a government official conducting government business. Of course, it's public record, but the Ohio Supreme Court has said not so fast. Under many circumstances, in fact, it is not a public record, which shows not only do we oftentimes have hostility from public records from our government officials and our legislators who make these rules, but also the courts that have to interpret them. The answer to that could potentially be no, actually, you're not entitled to it, but we still like to think that yes, you should be because it documents government business. And there's also an out there that says, well, if they don't rely on it, then that can be exempt from public records laws and you can be denied too. But again, that's more of a 2.0, 3.0 kind of discussion that goes a little bit beyond what we're talking about here tonight.
So this is another area that folks have wondered about. So basically, our voter rolls, public record. So that's kind of the first part of this. But the second part has to do with, what about the Secretary of State, and do we need to do public requests to find out what the Secretary of State actually gave to the Department of Justice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the kind of thing again gets back to an it depends kind of thing because there might be federal or state laws protecting some of that data or some of that information that would then make it exempt from public records. But otherwise, for instance, if you are trying to get down to the thought process, how things worked out in real time, the considerations. That's where public records can oftentimes prove very helpful. Journalists use that kind of thing oftentimes where you'll say like, hey, I want all of the emails between party A and party B on this specific topic. And the courts will want you to be absolutely as specific as possible. And they're getting tighter and tighter on that as the days, the months, and years go on. As far as I'm concerned, they're public records. You should be able to say, hey, send me all your emails, copies of all your emails. Might be a little unrealistic, I get it. But now they're at the point where, again, at a minimum, they want, tell us who party A is, who party party B is, what exactly they were discussing, and even down to perhaps a time frame of when the requester thinks that this type of conversation happened. So I think a lot of us use public records to dig deeper and find out how government officials and government offices came to a conclusion, a decision, a purchase, a vote on legislation, what have you. So public records can be generally very helpful in that regard as well.
Well, Gary, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce Randy Ludlow. So you might not be at all surprised that I wanted Randy to be on this webinar, Celebrate Sunshine Week with us. And that really has to do with, many of you will remember his Columbus Dispatch byline, and that he really focused on open government, just a champion of governmental transparency and public records. Prior to the Dispatch, he was at the Cincinnati Post for years. And so, Randy, I'm hoping you can share some tips. And also, I have a lot of worries about access to records at the Statehouse and some of the changes there. So we'd love to hear what you're thinking about.
Well, thank you. There is no doubt that both the General Assembly and the Ohio Supreme Court are making it increasingly difficult to obtain information about your government and its officials. I know in the case I had before the Ohio Supreme Court, I was trying to get the database of death records during the COVID pandemic to try to track deaths back to particular nursing homes, because the state wasn't, so they said, weren't keeping any numbers by nursing home. And we wanted the Court of Claims, as Gary mentioned, and then the state appeal. We lost the appellate court, went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ruled that while a death certificate is a public records, if you want the database of that, it's not a public record. Doesn't make much sense if you ask me. And they recently ruled that Marsy's Law, which protects the privacy and other information of crime victims, applied to police officers. And police can therefore withhold the names of police officers that the suspect shot at, for example, that cops in the line of their official duty are crime victims, and you don't deserve to know who they are. It's ridiculous assertions like this that is providing a slippery slope toward obtaining public records. But anyway, some of the tips to get a successful public records request is, don't go on a fishing expedition. Don't ask for anything and everything under the sun, a voluminous request. You're risking getting it rejected as the famous overly broad. They're going to throw you out. No, we can't give you this. You're asked for too much. You're not being specific enough. You need to be very specific. Provide names, dates, suggested records, every detail and specific you can to help narrow your request so you avoid the overly broad assertion. Now, you can request public records verbally, and they have to honor that. But in case you end up having to go to the Court of Claims or go to court, it's best to make it in writing so you have a record of what you asked for as well as the responses. We never ask for copies because 99% of the time they're going to give you copies anyway. But if you ask for copies, it statutorily gives them more time to fulfill your request. Whereas you duck just asking for copies, you should receive it quicker, or supposedly that's how it's suggested. The Court of Claims is a very good process, as Gary mentioned. When I worked at the Dispatch, and I personally won cases before the Court of Claims, they have experts on staff that help guide you through that process. A vast majority of the cases are resolved in mediation, or a simple call from the court and the people involved there to the offending party at the public who holds the public records. Gary mentioned a couple of my bugaboos that you'll need to be on lookout for requesting public records. Gary mentioned attorney-client privilege as a record for exemption. This is vastly overused and incorrect 9 times out of 10. What is exempt is the solicitation or the providing of legal advice. I cannot take an otherwise public record, copy it to a lawyer, and make it exempt from release simply because it went to a lawyer. So beware that the attorney-client only provides to legal advice, not copying a general correspondence to the lawyer and trying to take it off the table. Also, a thing that really bugs me, police incident reports, the basics, and oftentimes a great amount of detail on public records are one of the most abused records out there, because the cops want you to think they can redact everything, that you're not entitled to the rest of this stuff. That's incorrect. Under Supreme Court ruling and precedent, everything on a public record and attachments such as witness statements, officer narratives, etc., are a public record with the exception of Social Security numbers, information provided by a children's services agency. Those are the only things that are exempt from an incident report. They have to give you the title, the whole incident report, the names of victims, the names of suspects, whatever's in there, it's fair game for your records request. Don't let the police get away with claiming you're not entitled to that information. Beyond that, glad to answer any other questions or anything else.
Well, I wondered a little bit about the change in public records request at the Statehouse. So one of the things that happened is the legislation was passed that essentially said that the records that are created, the records that are created during the session, so during that General Assembly, they don't become public until after the session is over. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you think that impacts what the public knows, and impacts the kind of decisions that are made?
No, I think as we all know, at least the skeptics among us, is that lawmakers author very few bills. They have parties of interest that are given in the language they want to appear in the bill, and they basically write entire bills, hand it to their sponsor, and here you go. So they're trying to further hide some of that, because right now any correspondence between lawmakers and the Legislative Service Commission, which are the ones that actually write the bills, any correspondence between a lawmaker and the LSC is confidential. You can't get it. So yeah, they're very much trying to hide how they make laws.
What do you think about the argument about vexatious requests versus, hiding corruption or hiding information from the public? How do you think we should best balance that?
Well, I think that's overly broad. Yeah, I've heard of a few cases like that where people have a very much of a problem with somebody at public office. There's going to be over the head records, and that's not the intent of the law. And you can be declared a vexatious litigator beyond this specific part of the law. But most people have good designs and good intent in requesting public records. One thing I'd like to know, and I've got to look at the law better to be quite frankly, is what is the definition of a journalist? I mean, that as title has never been broader these days. Anybody with a blog and a notebook and a public records request can lay claim to being a journalist, because it's not a state sanctioned or licensed profession. And nor would I want it to be, but I've got to see what the definition is of a journalist.
Well, the other thing in terms of meetings that sometimes people try to understand is a round robin kind of meeting, a way to avoid public meeting, requirements. So I got a question basically about, how many people need to come together, but it started making me think about round robins and all of the different ways that a majority could avoid getting together at the same time.
No, I mean this dates back to when I was with the Cincinnati Post back in the dark ages. But anyway, we Cincinnati City Council had a situation where the city manager met with every council member individually, all nine of them, and that's not public. These were individual meetings, and the Ohio Supreme Court indeed ruled that you cannot have round robin meetings of less than a majority of council or another body to avoid the public meetings laws. And we've also had a similar ruling recently regarding Olentangy Public Schools. They were trying to meet via email and were called out as illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that decision because it was one where they said even a tweet, if they were tweeting back and forth, that could in fact be a violation of open meeting law. So I noticed that Donna said in here, the police don't write details on an incident report that they don't want released. And this gets back to like, what is a public record and the notion that it has to be something that is actually created. Can you tell us a little bit about how people?
No, there are police agencies that have essentially a records policy where they provide as little information possible in incident reports, so you can't get the greater volume of detail. They just don't do it in the incident report. And a big offender, one of the first, in fact, I think, is the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which your incident reports, you're lucky to get a blank piece of paper. But anyway, yes, I mean, there are all kinds of entities anywhere that go out of their ways to avoid creating public records so they don't have to give them to you.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I really appreciate is how willing you are to help people with records requests. So I just want everybody to let them know that I'm going to be sharing your email in the
Sure,
follow-up.
that'd help.
Just one of the things that is super clear to me is there are so many different types of government that it does take, kind of a citizen army to get enough information and different information. One of the questions that I also had to do with when you do a records request, you talked about it being fairly narrowly tailored, like don't go fishing. Can you kind of give an example of like when are you talking about asking for specific dates? Like how is it you would narrowly tailor it so that
Well,
it's
right, to the extent I can narrow down a date range as opposed to records from time immemorial. I want the emails between the mayor and this council member for the first 6 months of this year. Just don't ask for every email they've ever exchanged. Try to narrow down the topic, the dates, etc. Don't allow them an easy off the hook by claiming you're overly broad.
So, and I always think, despite the fact that we don't have to tell them who we are and we don't have to explain where we want it, I've often figured that some sugar actually helps, and developing a relationship, can make a difference with that public requester or the custodian of the record. Is that the kind of thing that you found as well?
Right, well, I mean, yes, try to be nice and cooperative at first. There's a lot of government officials out there that do want to help you to the extent they're allowed to. But yes, don't be adversarial at start. There'll be time for that later on when they deny your request.
Yeah.
Well, Randy, thank you. And I am going to turn to Kathiann Kowalski. She is also incredibly accomplished. She is a reporter that focuses on energy, science, and the surrounding policy issues. She is the author of 25 different books, and she is a graduate of Harvard Law School. So, Kathiann, take it away and tell us about online records.
Sure, glad to be here. This is actually the good news part of the program tonight, because there are things that we still have some access to, although you may have to be creative in trying to get a hold of it. And even if you only get part of it, you might still be able to do something with it. So to start off, I've just highlighted, the ongoing trial of former First Energy executives Chuck Jones and Michael Dowling. When Larry Householder and Matt Borges were on trial back in 2023, we did not have um, general videos, Zoom capability outside the courthouse. There was a Zoom playing in a room for reporters, but if you wanted to be there and follow the case as it happened, you had to go down there. So, in terms of access, things like this can be done in some of the state courts, and it's very helpful. If going to the next slide, you see an example this morning. Senator John Husted, former Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, did testify via video, not in person in the courtroom. And then next slide, within about 90 minutes after he finished, the Akron Beacon Journal had this nice kind of, live posting up of several posts that talked about what he said and what he did. And it was, if you went to it, you could get a good feel for what he was saying. You could make a judgment about, oh, there are questions that the prosecution should have asked and didn't, and so forth. So that's helpful, but that's not all there is. Next slide. The dockets for most courts in Ohio, or I don't know about most, I haven't done an 88 county survey, but for a fair number of counties, and certainly the larger ones, you can get access to court dockets online, and you can look up a case, you can click on the filings. So yesterday, when the money laundering charges were dismissed, I was able to just go right in and poof, there was Judge Susan Baker Ross's post right there. And I was able to throw that up on Twitter for everybody to read. So check that out. And even if it's not available or you can't get something online, very often if you tell the clerk of courts, I'm trying to get this and the digital copy isn't popping up, could you help me? I've had some pretty good luck with that. Next slide, just to make it clear, federal courts do not all do this. You can get United States Supreme Court briefs online and you can get the dockets. But for the lower federal courts, there's this thing called PACER. And while it says public access to court electronic records, it's subject to a cap, and beyond a certain amount, even for like digital copies that you're just looking at online, they'll charge you some money. So very often it helps to look in other sources where someone else has already paid the money and see if you can get it free. So next slide. Another example of that from the whole First Energy saga is this indictment that we had last year in federal court, also coincidentally against Chuck Jones and Michael Dowling, that was filed within days of Governor Mike DeWine naming John Husted to be the senator in place of J.D. Vance. This is all relevant and tied together because the four of these people had dinner together on December 18, 2018, and Husted testified today. He doesn't remember what was talked about. Anyway, next slide. When you're talking about regulatory records, you can also get some pretty good stuff. There was a question I answered in the chat where someone said, hey, why don't we publicize the PUCO hearings and cases? Well, they don't do that. The commission does actually televise on Zoom their regular commission meetings. Most of those are pretty pro forma, but they publish the agenda online and they will have links. And I've been able to look stuff up and get, whatever juicy things might have been said at a former public meeting of the commission, although usually they've made their decisions by the time they announce them. But for a case hearing or regulatory records, you have to go down. This is an example here of story I did where, it occurred to me, gee, we have lights going out, we have these bad storms, I wonder what's going on. And for every one of the utilities, there's actually a page you can go to, and you can click on it and see how good or bad did they do in meeting their reliability standards. And this matters now, not just historically, but because First Energy has currently got a case before the PUCO trying to relax their reliability standards. Duke Energy also has a case currently before the PUCO. So, this is relevant when you're considering, are we getting our money's worth as we're paying for capital improvements, as we're paying for rising electricity rates and so forth. Next slide. You can also get, in cases for the PUCO, various comments. You can get the pleadings. You can also get, copies of comments people filed on the docket. You can see who's representing the parties. So this is a story I did recently where I got a heads up that testimony was filed in the case. I looked up testimony by one of the parties, in this case, the developer, where they said, gee, a lot of these comments seem to be anonymous or not have valid addresses or emails. And, we looked and we didn't find them. So I reached out because, again, you get the contact information through the public records. And I asked, can you share this stuff with me? And they said, yes, we would. And so one snowy afternoon, it was a Friday afternoon, I poured myself a nice glass of white wine and set about checking things on voterrecords.com and whitepages.com. And, it turns out I was pretty much able to show that they were validate what they were saying. And then if we go to the next slide, while I was writing my story, it was a Saturday night, so I looked up a few more that just had been filed since then and found another 7 fake comments. So, that's important too. I'm done with the slides. My main point that I want to make is that it's worth taking a look at what you can in the public records. It's worth following up on things, and don't take no for an answer. A lot of times the agencies I found will try to say, no, you can't get that, or no, that's not a public record, or this is too broad, or that's too broad. And, sometimes I've gone back and said, no, this isn't too broad. I'm asking for something very specific. This is action you've taken. You must have had some documents about it. I'd like to know what they were, or some of them, like the Department of Health, loves to claim a critical infrastructure exemption. And I remember Lucia Waluncius, who was then heading up in Ohio, went and did a court of claims proceeding to say, no, we want data for when people, how many beds do hospitals have available? What equipment do they have available? Right? Like this was not a bridge or something that someone was going to blow up. This was something the public needed to know about. And again, whether you're a journalist or not a journalist, getting the information is helpful, and ultimately it helps all of us as well as our readers be better informed citizens. That's it.
Well, I have to say, I really liked your story that focused on, how the kind of the misuse of the public process,
Yeah.
and your ability to figure all of that out. I just thought that made, it just put into perspective how, the challenge and the problem. What made you think about doing it in the first place?
Frankly, I got a heads up that there was testimony in the case that had to do with it. And, I looked at it, and my response was not something I should be saying on Zoom, but I was sitting there reading this and saying things out loud. It was that egregious. And then I thought I need to verify this and follow it up. And in that particular case, it really matters because the Power Siting Board has, in multiple cases, said, well, if local townships abutting a project object, we're just going to decide that it's not in the public interest.
Yes.
And they've reached that even where the overwhelming majority of public comments said, we want this project, right? And some of the more recent comments in this case were people saying, we find it pretty outrageous that people have been abusing this process. And, we want you to focus on the real sentiments. And, again, it goes to the question of what is real, what are regulators considering? About a week after my story came out, there was a story about apparently hundreds of AI generated comments in California that led an air pollution control board to ditch a measure that would have limited natural gas stoves. So it does matter, and it's being done, and especially with AI, it could be a growing problem.
Well, I love how we're able to, with public records requests, connect the dots. I think that, at the end of the day, this is about better understanding what's happening in government. And this question, I'm actually going to transition over to Randy because he said he would be willing to answer this question. So the question was really about nonprofits that receive funding from from the government, but this is about like quasi-governmental entities, and you can imagine all sorts of agencies that in fact are big money from public dollars. But what happens with the public records, and are they public records when it comes to these quasi-governmental entities?
Okay, well, first of all, I would urge everybody to get the latest copy of the Open Government Handbook on the Attorney General's site, otherwise called the Yellow Book. It's the Bible to public records in Ohio, and I highly recommend everybody download that and become familiar with its contents. One of the ways to be successful in your public records request is to know the law better than they do. But anyway, to your question, this probably dates back to the 90s, maybe the Oriana House decision.
Yes.
Before the Ohio Supreme Court established what they called a government equivalency test. Does it do a function that typically would fall to government? Does government have some control over how they operate and are funded? And that in part determines whether or not a nonprofit is a public entity for the purposes of the Public Records Act. Now, there is an explicit public record provision affecting nonprofits under a very similar number, but under Ohio Revised Code 149.143, you are allowed to obtain records regarding the spending of government money or contracts by a nonprofit. So that's 149.143. That doesn't fall within the public records law. That's a separate section, but you are allowed, for example, to know how the Columbus Zoo spent its public tax levy money, and they have to give you records reflecting the spending of that.
Well, one of the questions we got had to do with executive sessions and how that works, and do we have access to information about what happens in executive sessions, and why can they go into executive session?
Okay, well, they're allowed to go into executive session for, I believe, there's 7 or 8 reasons: trade secrets, personnel actions, purchase of property. There's a lot of them. But the key to this is they are not to make any decisions in executive session. Sure, they can talk it out and get a general consensus what they're going to do, but to take any action, they have to come out of the executive session and do it in public session with people in attendance. Now, if they have an executive session scheduled, they have to provide you notice when that'll fall. But a public body does not need it scheduled to conduct a executive session during a normal meeting with nothing otherwise scheduled. Somebody can call for an executive session. They go adjourn to it. That's legal. They can do it on the spot. But you have to keep an eye on the rascals that they're not indeed making decisions by an executive session. I'd be very suspicious if it's something very controversial and they all come out of an executive session, no discussion, and everybody votes yes or no. But keep an eye on them.
Well, this is the other one. People are paying close attention to Jobs Ohio after OSU president has left the building. Are those records from Jobs Ohio public records? How does that work?
Jobs Ohio is funded by the Ohio State Liquor Enterprise, by the profits from that. And under the John Kasich administration, he thought we could have a more responsive economic development agency than the Department of Development. So they created the publicly created the private Jobs Ohio. You are not entitled to get any records of theirs, with the exception of about once a year, they do have to provide to the legislature, and therefore you can get it too. The salaries they're paying people, any spending on governmental officials, things along these lines. And we always did stories on that every year around the deadline, which I believe was late March, for them to submit this information. Then we could obtain it from Jobs Ohio. But no, you're not allowed to find out what they're working on or what they're spending money on otherwise.
So we're all a bunch of redistricting reformers, and on this fair democracy call, one of the things that was really hard has to do with the map making that happened behind the scenes. And, one of the questions was about kind of public records related to the congressional map making. And so are those public records?
Well,
of the Ohio Redistricting Commission?
Well, this mostly occurred outside my presence. I was involved in other things, but anything that they've done publicly and introduced in the record certainly should be a public record. Now, of course, of great interest to us is everything that went on behind the scenes. But again, you're going to find they don't create records for those. Everything's verbal. And I would note when it does come to public records, you're entitled to it, whether it's audio, video, digital, the full gamut, you're entitled to it. But they're not recording their secret discussions, no.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to say a big thank you to Gary, Kathiann, and Randy. We're hitting up against 7 o'clock. And I also wanted to remind us there are so many different areas where we need greater transparency. And one of the things that we should have a vision of is, open democracy, open elections, open government. And so this is just a picture of what could be possible. You'll notice the Jim Siegel disclosure bill that was named after the late reporter Jim Siegel, because let's face it, the Legislative Service Commission records used to be public records and they no longer are. And that means that reporters basically have to get tips for all sorts of times when somebody introduces a bill, for example, that was provided to them by a corporation. They basically need to have a little bit of insider knowledge rather than the ability to go and look and see what's going back and forth with the Legislative Service Commission. And of course, we should be able to follow the money. There are a bunch of different online things that, Kathiann talked about this, but I, just want to encourage people to check out the Ohio House information, check out the Ohio Senate. Also, I find the lobbying information completely fascinating. It's not detailed enough, but well worth taking time. If you're a money and politics person, the Secretary of State's site is a bit clunky, but It also provides some good information. It does have a search function if you want to be absolutely sure you want to download things. And then Randy was willing to share, his email. I also want to let you know that please, contact us. We want to be there to answer your questions and to encourage you all to take action. So the next huddle, yeah, Mia, why don't you tell us about the
Yeah,
next
I was
huddle?
going to jump in. So we are, I think the League, a League of Women Voters is going to take the lead on this one and talk to us about primaries and why they're so important. And this will be, of course, before our primary, but during early vote. And so that'll be like really a deep dive into that topic. And then at that one, we'll announce what the next topic is. And just because it is about beginning of April will be the voter registration deadline for the primary, we wanted to make sure to encourage you to check your voter registration. It's getting more and more important for you to check your voter registration before you go to vote, and make sure that everything is up to date, so that you don't end up having to vote provisionally. You can check either at voteohio.gov or this site here, voteforohio.com. And the Secretary of State does have a voter information toolkit that you can use to share information such as this graphic about voter registration, etc. So yes, just want to make sure that you know about our next event, which is the second Wednesday of April, which somebody tell me what date that is. And we will be sending you slides and a recording and a follow-up email from today. Katherine, you are muted.
Oh, I was going to say that'll be April 8th.
April
And
8th.
don't be surprised that by tomorrow you will have all sorts of information. And if it feels overwhelming, Gary said he was available to help. Randy said he was available to help, and I am here too. And thank you all for joining us
Guys,
for our first Fair Democracy Huddle.
thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you,
great evening.
everybody. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Kathiann. Thank you, Gary. And thank you,
Bye.
Mia.
And Kelly.
And Kelly. We always need that support, making sure we get everything out there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Y'all soon.
Good night.